In the early months of the war, many German soldiers were filled with unwavering confidence. Trained under strict discipline and indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, they believed themselves invincible. When the Allied forces captured them, a mix of disbelief and pride ran through the ranks. These men had been taught that surrender was shameful, yet here they were, disarmed and marched into British prisoner-of-war camps. Despite their situation, conversations among the prisoners often centered on tales of German military genius, recounting victories at the front, and imagining that any setback was temporary. They clung to the notion that the Third Reich would soon turn the tide, and that liberation was only a matter of time. Guards reported that many prisoners initially refused to accept the reality of defeat, maintaining their rigid routines and military bearing, holding tightly to the illusions instilled by years of propaganda. Even in captivity, they projected an air of authority, attempting to uphold the morale of their fellow soldiers, confident that their nation's triumph was inevitable. Life inside the British POW camps was a strange mix of monotony and small freedoms. German soldiers, once used to strict military structure and battlefield command, found themselves in a controlled but surprisingly orderly environment. Barracks were crowded but maintained, with regular meal times and roll calls replacing frontline chaos. Prisoners spent hours performing chores, maintaining their huts, or repairing camp facilities, all under the watchful eyes of the British Guards. Many attempted to create routines to preserve a sense of normalcy, holding informal lectures, playing sports, or teaching each other skills to pass the time. Mail from home was scarce, heightening feelings of isolation, yet newspapers and clandestine radios became prized sources of connection to the world outside. Some prisoners tried to escape, testing fences and watch schedules, while others quietly observed, waiting for news of the war. Despite captivity, camaraderie developed among men who shared stories, jokes, and the occasional letter, offering psychological relief. These routines and interactions, small and human, formed the invisible lifelines that kept prisoners from succumbing entirely to despair, giving them both structure and hope within the confines of barbed wire. From the earliest days of the war, German soldiers were steeped in Nazi propaganda that shaped their understanding of reality. Radio broadcasts, carefully scripted by the regime, painted a picture of unbroken German victories and downplayed losses or setbacks. Soldiers inside POW camps clung to these messages, recalling reports of heroic feats and the supposed incompetence of Allied forces. Posters, leaflets, and camp briefings reinforced this illusion, portraying Germany as destined to triumph and the enemy as weak and divided. Even when soldiers faced defeat in battle, many rationalized it as temporary, confident that the truth on the radio would soon vindicate them. These false narratives became a psychological shield, helping men maintain pride and morale despite the growing reality of war's devastation. Inside the camp, discussions often reflected this distorted worldview. Prisoners debated imagined victories, criticized Allied tactics, and held on to the idea that their nation's glory was imminent. It was only when they first heard and censored Allied broadcasts that the carefully constructed world of lies began to crumble, shattering their beliefs and forcing them to confront truths they had long denied. For the German POWs, the first encounter with British radio was both thrilling and terrifying. Radios were officially forbidden, yet some prisoners managed to secretly tune in, desperate for news beyond the barbed wire. As the crackling voice of a British announcer filled the room, the camp fell silent. Soldiers strained to catch every word, realizing that the world outside was far different from the reality they had been taught. Reports of German defeats, civilian hardships, and Allied advances contradicted years of indoctrination. Initially, some refused to believe the broadcasts, blaming enemy lies or technical errors. Others sat in stunned silence, hearts sinking as the extent of their nation's struggles became clear. The voice from the radio was more than information, it was a revelation. It shattered illusions, exposing the fragility of the propaganda that had sustained their confidence. In that moment, the POWs experienced a profound psychological shift, recognizing that the war was not the glorious campaign they had imagined, but a complex, costly conflict whose outcomes were no longer in German hands. As the British radio continued to speak, German POWs heard details that shook them to their core. Reports described crushing defeats on the Eastern Front, lost territories, and the staggering number of casualties among German troops, losses that had been completely omitted or minimized in their own broadcasts. Soldiers listened in disbelief as the announcer recounted the collapse of supply lines, the relentless advance of Allied forces, and the suffering of civilians in bombed cities. For many, the reality of these defeats was impossible to ignore. The broadcasts painted a vivid picture of a war far harsher and more costly than they had imagined. Men who had been proud of their military prowess felt a wave of shame, fear, and helplessness. Conversations in the camp shifted from boasting about imaginary victories to silent contemplation. The contrast between the comforting lies of Nazi propaganda and the stark truths reported by the British radio forced the prisoners to confront the reality. Germany was losing, and the outcome of the war was no longer in their favor. The broadcast became a turning point, breaking through layers of indoctrination and leaving an indelible mark on the minds of every listener. When the British radio broadcast reached the ears of the German POWs, an almost tangible silence fell over the camp. Men who had once spoken loudly of courage and imagined victories froze mid-conversation, their faces pale with disbelief. The usual clatter of daily routines, the clinking of utensils, the shuffle of boots, the murmur of conversation, vanished. Every ear strained to capture the truth of the voice that contradicted everything they had been taught. Prisoners exchanged glances, some gripping each other's arms in shared shock, others staring blankly at the ground. The enormity of the information, the real defeats, the lost battles, the human cost of the war, hit them simultaneously, leaving no room for discussion or denial. Even the camp guards, observing from a distance, noted the eerie stillness that replaced the usual noise. For the first time, the prisoners confronted a collective understanding. The war was slipping away from their nation. That moment of silence was not just absence of sound. It was the audible weight of truth settling over men who had long lived in the comforting shadow of lies. It marked a turning point, the first step toward the painful recognition of reality. After the initial shock of hearing the British broadcasts, the German POWs struggled with a turbulent mix of emotions. Disbelief was the first reaction. Soldiers refused to accept that their nation had suffered such devastating losses. Some blamed the Allies for spreading lies, while others quietly questioned everything they had been taught. Anger soon followed, anger at their leaders for misleading them, anger at themselves for believing propaganda, and even anger at fellow prisoners who seemed more willing to accept the grim truth. In private corners of the camp, men wrestled with guilt and shame, recalling battles where comrades had fallen and wondering if their sacrifices had been in vain. Small arguments and tense stares became common, reflecting an internal struggle between denial and acceptance. Many found it impossible to sleep, haunted by images of destroyed cities, dead soldiers, and the harsh reality of the front lines. This psychological fracture weakened the rigid morale that had been instilled through years of indoctrination, leaving prisoners vulnerable to despair. Yet, amid the chaos of thought and feeling, a grudging clarity began to emerge. The war was far from the glorious endeavor they had envisioned, and facing that truth was unavoidable. As days passed and more broadcasts were secretly heard, the German POWs began to confront an undeniable truth. Their nation was losing the war. Reports of collapsing fronts, encircled armies, and cities in ruins painted a grim picture that propaganda could no longer conceal. Soldiers who had once imagined swift victory now faced the stark reality that the outcome was beyond their control. Conversations in the camp shifted from speculation to reluctant acknowledgement, as men discussed what they had heard in whispers, trying to reconcile pride with failure. The realization struck with a heavy weight. Germany's military might was no longer invincible, and the war's end, favorable or not, was inevitable. This understanding brought both fear and resignation. Many felt a personal sense of loss for comrades left on the battlefield, while others struggled with the shame of having been deceived for so long. For the first time, the prisoners collectively grasped the scale of defeat, and with it came a profound shift in mindset. The war was no longer a distant, abstract campaign. It was a reality already decided, leaving them to reckon with the consequences of their nation's actions and the futility of further resistance. By the time German POWs had fully absorbed the reports from British radio, the formidable illusion crafted by Nazi propaganda began to crumble. The lies and exaggerations that had sustained their confidence and pride for years now appeared hollow and fragile. Soldiers realized that the truths they had ignored or dismissed were far more powerful than any carefully constructed narrative. Even those who had clung most stubbornly to previous beliefs could no longer deny the overwhelming evidence of defeats, civilian suffering, and the relentless advance of Allied forces. Small discussions in the camp turned to reflections on reality versus illusion, as men slowly accepted that propaganda could never withstand the clarity of factual reporting. The psychological impact was profound. Shame, humility, and newfound clarity replaced arrogance and unquestioning loyalty. For many, this revelation marked a critical turning point, demonstrating how exposure to truth could break through layers of indoctrination. It was a lesson in the enduring power of information. While propaganda may shape perception temporarily, undeniable facts have the ability to awaken even the most disciplined minds to reality, forcing them to confront what they had long refused to see. Following the British radio broadcasts, the German POWs emerged from their initial shock with a fundamentally changed perspective. The long-held certainties of military invincibility and national superiority were replaced by a cautious, sobering awareness of reality. Men began to reassess their understanding of the war, their leaders, and even themselves. Conversations shifted from boasting of past victories to sharing observations, regrets, and reflections on mistakes both at the front and in belief. Many developed a deeper empathy for civilians and soldiers alike, recognizing the human costs that had been obscured by propaganda. This new mindset fostered patience and pragmatism. Survival within the camp became a priority, and psychological resilience grew in place of blind confidence. Letters home and discussions among prisoners took on a more honest, measured tone, reflecting a desire to reconcile their experiences with truth rather than illusion. By the time the war ended, those who had listened closely to the broadcasts carried a changed worldview, a mix of humility, awareness, and a recognition that information and critical thought could break through even the strongest indoctrination. The silence that had once swept the camp had evolved into understanding, shaping the way these men saw their past, their nation, and the future that awaited them.